Hello, in this video we're going to be looking at a kind of a general overview of photosynthesis, so let's not waste any of your time. Let's get right to it. Now when we're thinking about photosynthesis, we want to recognize that it's got two parts. Okay, the first part is the light-dependent reaction. It's called the light-dependent reaction because it needs the light energy from the sun to begin the process. Part two of photosynthesis, the Calvin cycle, it does not need light energy. It's a chemical energy process, building the glucose molecule, so it is light independent. Okay, but commonly known as, and I'll refer to it mostly as the Calvin cycle. It used to be referred to as the dark reaction, give that light reaction, dark reaction, but it's not that it's in the dark or an absence of light, so that name doesn't really, you'll see it if you do enough reading, enough websites, but we're talking the light dependent reaction. The LDR is what you'll see on the screen a lot. As I mentioned, I'll just for typing, saving space, LDR is what you'll see, but I'll say the name out loud, and the Calvin cycle. In the light-dependent reaction, the LDR, you've got two parts, photosystem 1, photosystem 2, and again, these are the series of steps that I referred to earlier, that there's a lot of repeated steps. And there's a lot of steps that are similar to the electron transport chain. That's essentially what's happening with a little bit of modifications for photosynthesis. But the idea of making ATP, taking those electron carriers, again, we'll see those people once again, or those objects once again, with a little addition, the NAD plus molecule that we talked a lot about in cellular respiration now has a phosphate on it, so it's NADP, but it's going to get reduced just like in cellular respiration because it's going to be carrying those H's, okay, taking those electrons to the places that they need to go. And again, the Calvin cycle making more ATPs. And of course, those ATP molecules that are made in the LDR, the light-dependent reaction, are going to be causing that endergonic-exergonic reaction to where it's being built, so it's endergonic, but when it's broken apart in the Calvin cycle to supply that energy, now we've got an exergonic reaction. So it's that coupled reaction, coupled pathways that we talked about in cellular respiration, to where the first transaction makes, and when it's broken apart, it supplies energy for that. So again, the idea of these things happening in tandem will continue. Okay, continuing to think about photosynthesis, what you can see here beside me is a image of, obviously it's an animated image of the light dependent reaction, but you can see the proteins there. You can see the electrons moving through the process. You can see H's going through proteins, and to the far left, far right I should say, you can see the ATP synthase protein with H's going through it and ATP being made. So those steps are very, very similar to the electron transport chain in for cellular respiration that we talked about in our last chapter. So you should be very familiar with this process, familiar enough to where you can pick up all the things that you're already aware of, and the processes that are new and unique to photosynthesis. We will spend lots of opportunity to learn those subtle steps that go through this process of getting the components needed for the Calvin cycle. Okay, so the light-independent reaction, better known as the Calvin cycle, again, you can see that it's circular, just like the Krebs cycle was. And what you're going to see is that it has lots of similar, the steps aren't similar as far as what actually is happening, but the overall process of what's happening is very similar. This time the main difference is that now we're building a molecule. So we're still going to be having our redox reactions to where one molecule gets reduced, one molecule gets oxidized, but it's the opposite. In cell respiration, the glucose molecule was being oxidized, and the electron carriers, electron transporters, were getting reduced. Now the opposite will be happening. The glucose molecule that's being built, it will be getting reduced because we're going to be adding things to it, and the carriers are now bringing materials in to help build this process. They're bringing in the carbon dioxide. They're bringing in the waters. Okay, they're bringing in the phosphates that are needed to make this stuff. So, but again, 3 stages, and we'll talk about the Calvin cycle has its own video. We'll talk about that. But the idea of carbon fixation, in other words, it's going to be taking carbon dioxide and breaking it apart, and then slowly adding those carbons to the glucose molecule. Now, the Krebs cycle was just once around, and it got its job done and got ready for the next one. But the Calvin cycle is different in a way that it takes lots of spins around the cycle to get this built. It adds a carbon molecule. Each time it goes around the circle, it adds a carbon element to the glucose molecule. So if it needs 6 C's to build it, so we're talking 6 times around the cycle. Each time around it adds an O, and then each time around it adds a couple of hydrogens to get that 1 to 2 to 1 ratio. So 6 times around to completely build a glucose molecule. But the back third, as I mentioned, and we'll showcase this in the Calvin cycle video, that it replenishes, renews, reconfigures the starting molecule to get ready for the next cycle. Okay, some other concepts to think about with photosynthesis is the relationship between the different variables of this process, the components, and the plants themselves. Now, what's the diagram over there? That's the top half is the thylakoid membrane, the thylakoid, and then the bottom half is the stroma inside of the chloroplast. The light-dependent reaction happens in that membrane, as you can see, and the Calvin cycle happens in the stroma. But back to the relationships, it relies on the sun's light energy. Okay, that's super important. So if that light energy is increased, in other words, we get more of it, then we're going to increase the photosynthetic process. If we decrease that, the opposite then happens. We're going to decrease how much photosynthesis we can occur. Excuse me. Same with the carbon dioxide that we need for those C's and O's. If we increase the amount that we have, then we can increase how much we make. And if we decrease that, we're going to decrease the amount that we make. Well, that's our overview of the process of photosynthesis. When we come back next time, we're going to start to look at the chlorophylls and the pigments. So we'll see you then.